to see you too. You know, bismachot, as they say, because the last time we were talking was during my father's shiva and
Yeah.
funeral back at Allah Shalom back in December. So it's first of all, it's wonderful to be home again. It's wonderful, particularly to talk about my new novel, so much of which actually takes place in this synagogue. It's extraordinary and derives its title from a quote from Psalm 145 that used to be on the wall of the sanctuary in gold painted wooden letters. The Lord is near to all who call upon him, to all who call upon him in truth. So let me begin with a couple of truths of my own. I'll just give you, thank you for not delving into a lengthy introduction, but here I'll give you my lengthy introduction and how I came about to writing these books. And yes, I grew up in West Orange. My mother still lives off of Laurel Avenue on Ahern Way. She's still a member of the Shul. And I grew up what was then known as the JCWO, the Jewish Center of West Orange. And there I was thrown out of Hebrew school. There I read my bar mitzvah in transliteration, mind you, because I never learned to actually read and write Hebrew in that Hebrew school. I mean, how could you? My Hebrew school teacher's name was Rabbi Gurkoff. Okay, try being 12 years old to keep a straight face with that one. Rabbi Gurkoff, great teacher. But at age 12, I came home from school with a very strange feeling, not the usual strange feeling you expect from a 12-year-old boy. I came home and I had a poem. I started writing poetry. My first poem was called Who Cries for the Soul of the Pigeon? Very depressing adolescent poem. And I later collected I had a collection of poetry called Who Cries for the Soul of the Pigeon. I walked it into New York City to Alfred Knopf and gave it to the secretary there. She couldn't believe this 13-year-old kid is handing in this manuscript. 2 days later, it was rejected. I went up to my room and cried for 2 days. Little did I know that was going to be the first of a great many rejections. I saved them all. They're like in a file, the width of what, if you remember what a New York phone book used to look like, that's what they look like. And believe it or not, I still get rejected today. Believe me, and I'll tell you more about it later. To be a writer is to really get knocked down all the time. You have to pick yourself up. But that's who I was. I didn't have any choice. So I went back to writing poetry. Then I went writing short fiction. When I was 17, I wrote a film script, script for a short film called Comrades in Arms. Made the film. It won the first prize in the PBS Young Filmmakers Contest, put me on television. Of course, I was going to go to Hollywood after that. And I went to Hollywood. And I became Orson Welles' assistant. I've been in several Middle Eastern wars. None of them were as bad as being Orson Welles' assistant. Terrifying, truly terrifying man. There was one clear path, and that was that I was going to stay in Los Angeles. I was going to write film scripts. I was going to write novels. I was going to write short stories. But I had another side of me, which I couldn't sort of suppress. And that was a part of me that developed in spite of the fact that I got kicked out of Hebrew school, in spite of my problems with Rabbi Gurkoff and my inability to learn Hebrew. I was deeply committed to the Jewish people, to Jewish history, to the state of Israel. Where I grew up in West Orange, we were the only Jewish family. I think we're probably still the only Jewish family on that block, Rabbi Tobin. And I experienced a great deal of anti-Semitism, fighting all the time. So that had a profound impact on me. My father's World War II experiences, fighting the Nazis in World War II, had a profound impact on me. I grew up during the period of the Six-Day War, where everyone remembers the great victory of '67, but we forget that for 3 weeks before that, we thought Israel was going to be destroyed, and that the Jewish people would witness a second Holocaust within a single generation, and no one was going to do anything. That had a profound impact, and from age 15 on, I decided that's it. I was going to live in the state of Israel. I'd never been there yet. With the USY, I went to Washington, D.C., and I met Israel's ambassador to the United States. I shook his hand. And at age 15, I decided that's what I want to be when I grow up. I was going to be Israel's ambassador to the United States. I haven't been in Israel yet, and I was going to be its ambassador to the United States. His name was Yitzhak Rabin. I ended up being an advisor to Yitzhak Rabin until his assassination in 1995. And I started going to Israel every summer. I was a greenskeeper at the Crestmont Country Club. I saved up all my money on every vacation to go to Israel to work on a kibbutz for free. That's how crazy I was. I was a terrible farmer. I think kibbutzniks were very happy to see me go. I left a trail of wrecked tractors, things. And but eventually After college, I made Aliyah with a backpack, went right into the Army, became a paratrooper, became an officer in the IDF, ended up spending a total of about 35 years of active reserve duty in the IDF. Came back for graduate school in Middle Eastern studies, wrote books about the Middle East, about Middle East diplomacy, about Middle East military history, and always very politically active. In 2009, I got my dream when I became Israel's ambassador to the United States for 5 years. Came back and ran for Knesset, was elected, served as Netanyahu's deputy, which is another horrific story. And that's a very interesting story. And in between, raised a wonderful Israeli family, now with 3 children and 5.5 grandchildren, all of whom are living here and thriving. And it's moving to Israel was the greatest, smartest decision I ever made in my life. I'm so smart not staying in Los Angeles. But throughout all of this, I remained a writer, just who I was. Back in the year 2000, I published my first collection of novellas. It's called Sand Devil. It is the best collection of novellas about the Negev desert, because it's the only collection of novellas about the Negev desert. It's 3 stories set in the Negev. I lived in the Negev for 5 years. In 2004, I published a novel. My first novel was called Reunion, and it was about based on my father's war stories. It's a murder mystery. I like murder a lot. Almost all my stories deal with murders for some reason. I don't know why. Not that I don't live in a violent area, with the rockets coming in here. And then there was a long hiatus. There's a long hiatus because in Israel, as in the United States, if you are in high office, you cannot publish books. You can write books, but you can't publish them. So I continued writing, and it was only when I finished my Knesset and government service, starting in 2019, 2020, that I took my collected short stories, there's 51 of them, into The Night Archer and Other Stories. So part of those stories were written when I was actually in Knesset and in office, but I couldn't publish them. So it was a great release to have it published. And now my newest book, To All Who Call on Truth, which came out just in May, and it's a novel. It's a novel set in a suburban community, half of which is Jewish, half of which is Italian, if you remember West Orange back then, set in 1972, around a synagogue too. And it's about a junior high school guidance counselor who's also a football coach and basketball and baseball coach, who is confronting challenges in his life. He's a man of his times. And it's about the search for truth, our personal search for truth. The writing in general for me, whether it be short stories or novels, is a very Jewish undertaking. I always think of writing in Jewish terms. You know, we have, you know, I'm living in Jaffa. We dig underground here. We come up with all sorts of artifacts, but we're hard pressed to find a unique Jewish architecture form. We know in the Bible that our ancestors played instruments, but we don't know what they sounded like. But what we do have in vast abundance is literature. Wonderful stories. We have novels that we're just now finishing close to the end of Sefer Dvarim, and you know the story of the Exodus from Egypt is a classic Odyssey story of someone trying to get home and encountering challenge after challenge. Classic Odyssey story. But we also have short stories. The Book of Jonah, set in Jaffa. It's all of a page and a half long, but it's fabulous drama. A great economy of language. And Jewish literature comes with a Jewish concept, very much linked to the Jewish concept of liberty. We have many words for liberty and freedom in Hebrew, the chofesh and dro and atzmaut. But it's a certain type of liberty. When we get liberated from Egypt, but then we go right to Sinai. When at Sinai, we're informed that in order to be truly free, we have to put limitations on our freedom. It's that paradox, that Jewish paradox of freedom. We're the only people in the world, I think, that has a holiday dedicated to freedom, but it's the holiday that imposes the greatest restrictions on us. You know, go figure. And that's precisely what writing is. As a writer, whether it's short stories or novels, I can be anything. I can be anywhere I want to be at any time. I can be a man, a woman. I could be straight. I could be gay. I can be African American. I can be Asian. I can be anything I want to be. And yet, that writing comes with immense discipline, all the time discipline. Short stories in particular, where you have to get on 3 pages what a novelist gets in 300. That's the huge discipline of writing. And so I always think of writing as being sort of inherently Jewish for us, that paradox, that Jewish paradox of no freedom without restrictions. By the way, it's a great gift to the Jews, to Western civilization, to the founding fathers of your country in the Constitution. Certainly, they understood that. And this story in particular brings me back to my Jewish roots, to my roots in West Orange, New Jersey. And it brings me back to a period in my life which was very transformative and formative, the early 1970s. Why go back? Why go back? Well, obviously for personal reasons it was important, but I think also for those of us who lived through that period, and I'm looking at some of the faces that are looking at me, yeah, you guys lived through that period too. Rabbi Tobin, you're a little young, you were a kid. Is that it was a period where if you asked American young people back then what future they saw for their country, they probably didn't see much of a future because the campuses were on fire and federal offices were being bombed and America was still bogged down in Vietnam and the Watergate scandal was breaking out. The country looked very, very bleak. And there was parts of those early 70s that from my mind sort of evoked the current political situation and morass in the United States. That deep polarization, the sense of, I don't know, loss of confidence in the future, hope. It was also a unique period for the Jewish people, for American Jewish community. It was the last time which I believe the American Jewish communities or American Jews were a distinct ethnicity. Back in the early 1970s, only Jews ate bagels. This Jew hated bagels. They were horrible. They were hard and, oh God, white. They didn't have like all, salt and garlic bagels. It wasn't even thought of. We had our Jewish music and we had our Jewish jokes. And if you were given a form for university where you had to put down your ethnic group, you put down Jewish. And very, very distinct. I remember I played sports in college and scrolled on the wall of the bathroom was the following question: are Jews white? And the answer somebody had written in the bottom, yes, but. Okay, today there's no but. Today Jews are, supremely white. But we weren't thought of as white back then, and I don't think I was even raised thinking I was right. I was raised to thinking I was Jewish. So it's that moment in American Jewish history. And it's American Jewish history, that moment in which we had some very towering and influential figures. In the book, there are cameo appearances by thinly disguised characters who resemble Elie Wiesel, who I saw for the first time speaking when I was 15 at the JCC. And it was amazed that someone was actually on a stage talking about the Holocaust, because back then we didn't talk about the Holocaust, we whispered about it. There is Shlomo Kalibach, who kissed me at the JCWO. I'll never forget it. And there was Meir Kahane, who also came to give a talk at the synagogue back in 1971 with some very traumatic consequences. No spoiler alerts here. And I'm also capturing a time of spiritual vapidness in American Jewish history, American Jewish history. I go to synagogues today and I attend bar mitzvahs, and the level of Hebrew from the students at your synagogue, at B'nai Shalom, is just extraordinary to me. We never had anything like that. And the level of spirituality. And my main character, Sandy Cooper, is looking for that type of spirituality. He can't find it. And it's interesting that the most spiritual character in the synagogue is Temple Beth El, is the janitor, the custodian, who's an African American named Lewis, who those of you who have been members of the synagogue for many, many years will I think will recognize in the character of the custodian back then named Gary. And Gary had also a profound influence on my life. He taught me to play chess, just like in the series, right? And every time I wandered into the sanctuary, would come along and slap a kippah on my head and say to him and would walk around while he was cleaning, reciting the Psalms. Extraordinary man, extraordinary man. So that was the world, and that is this book, and that is why I write, and that is also how I write. And it is not an easy book. my next book, I was just in America selling my next novel, which is not about Jews and is not as difficult. Again, it's a murder mystery. I can talk about it a bit if you'd like. I'd love to. I love the book. And that's it in a nutshell. Your questions, please.
I have a question just to start us out, because I would say, over the course of the past week, anticipating this, I've had a bunch of people who kind of pop themselves right in front of me. And here they're all asking some version of the same question, which is, what was your thought process regarding reflecting people like Gary or other people? The one where the name doesn't seem to change is you have a Rabbi Stanley in the book, a Rabbi Stan, who's the young new rabbi in town and so forth. And obviously, so you went through some kind of a process, because there's a lot of names in there where people have been playing the guessing game with me. Well, that name sounds a lot like this person who I knew was around at that time. And I wonder if, right? So can you explore with us a little bit the decision-making about how you draw the line between, real people for your inspiration to create a character, and when the names are changed to protect the innocent and that kind of stuff, that aspect of the writing?
Well, the answer is I don't. And there's no decisions involved. Stories come to me, I don't go to them. They come to me very often fully formed. I often imagine the structure of a book being like an expansion bridge. Sort of like think the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, where I see where the story begins, I see where it ends, I don't know quite know how it meets in the middle, and the characters appear to me. It is a strange and spiritual experience, where a character will appear on the stage, on the page, often in a very minor role, and yet over the course of dozens, sometimes hundreds of pages, that character will reveal herself or himself to me and to be very full character. The names are, as a matter of fact, if the fact that you just mentioned Stan, like Stanley Azikov, and that the junior rabbi's name Stan, it didn't even occur to me. I never made that connection. It's random. I had a guidance counselor in junior high school named Sandy. Okay, Sandy Pollock, a wonderful man, terrific man, who was also my football coach. Sandy Pollock would roll his sleeves up inside rather than outside. And my character, Sandy, in the book does that, but I do that too. And I had to figure out why I do that, because of Sandy Pollock. He wore his watch on the inside, I wear it on the outside. But it wasn't conscious. And each of these characters are composites of many, many people, many people. I had a friend in high school whose mother was accused of killing his father with a Japanese souvenir sword. I don't remember the guy's name, but a real story. He lived opposite the library, and near the tennis courts there. And the strangest thing, and somehow this story, which only filaments I remember, became the central story in this novel. Go figure. I could pick it apart. I'm just very randomly. Sandy Cooper has a father who's in an old age home similar to the Daughters of Israel. And he sits and he listens only to show tunes. That's the only music he'll listen to. And he sits there singing show tunes. That was the father of a girlfriend I had very briefly in college, who sat there singing show tunes. I don't remember his name, but it's there, it's stuck there. I don't want to mix metaphors, but a writer's mind is often like alphabet soup. And sometimes a W appears on the surface, and sometimes a T, and sometimes a D. And you scoop them up and you put them on the page. I know that's the best metaphor I can have for it. Robert Lowell, the poet, talked about dipping a pail into a stream of words and thoughts and raising it up. I think that's the closest thing. It's kind of a random process, which I don't pretend to understand. I really don't. I don't. In short stories, sometimes it's clearer to me. but I'm referring to a very specific experience.
That's fascinating. Thank you, Michael. I appreciate that. Let's open up for people attending.
Larry has a question.
Yeah, Michael, thank you very much for joining us this morning. Early in the book, a Jewish kid is being physically bullied by multiple junior high school students. Finally, Sandy Cooper, as you described, a coach and guidance counselor, advises the student to just fight back, which he does, and severely beats one of the bullies. Sandy Cooper is severely criticized for his advice, and his job is made tenuous. And this seems to initiate a moral decline. Are you making a broader point about how American Jews and the rest of the world view Jews as they physically defend themselves, and even broader about how American Jews and the rest of the world view Israel as it defends itself?
I think it's a great question. It's extrapolating a bit much. Again, it relates to experience I had in junior high school, where I was getting the crap beat out of me. I was a fat, rather uncoordinated kid. I was always picked on, bullied. And one day, Sandy Pollock said to me, "Why don't you just next kid who hits you, hit him back?" And it turned out the kid who hit me was my best friend. And I hit him back. I socked him in the mouth. And we both got sent to the principal's office. And I went into Sandy and I said, "Wait, that's not fair. You told me to hit the kid." He says, "Yeah, but I didn't tell you weren't going to get punished for it." And I'll never forget. Well, okay, that's the kernel of the story and the plot. But of course, this goes a completely different direction. No, it's not meant to some type of comment on the way American Jews defend themselves or don't defend themselves and how they're perceived as when they defend themselves. But what it does make a comment about is about anti-Semitism. So when I started writing this book several years ago, and I started writing about anti-Semitism in the school and in the community, my fear was that American Jews would say, "Oh no, this doesn't ring true. This is lacking verisimilitude because there's not anti-Semitism like that." Today, in 2021, I can't think you're going to find any American Jew who would say that. And in fact, the anti-Semitism of this book can seem rather lightweight compared to what's going on in the United States right now. And so there's anti-Semitism in this book, and I don't know. It may be the only contemporary novel to deal seriously with the legacy of American anti-Semitism. I can't verify that, but I got a strong suspicion.
Thank you.
Zach Narrett, go ahead.
Hello, Michael. I've enjoyed many of your books. Just wanted to ask you a question about your approach to writing history versus literature, whether you might return to history someday, and about the various skills and disciplines involved, satisfaction you get from writing each.
Thanks. Listen, they come from very different parts of my brain. I usually like to start my day writing fiction if I can, and then move to history or write an op-ed. I write for the Atlantic. I write for Tablet. I'm writing an article for Tablet today, and it just doesn't interfere. It comes from very different places. What they have in common is I use tools. So in my new novel that I've just completed, it's set in 1944, 1945 on a maritime island off the coast of New England. And I had to do serious research on what life was like in New England in the 1940s, the way people spoke, what they dressed, what they ate, what the inside of their cars looked like. I mean, really deep research. So I'm drawing on skills that I've learned as an historian. Conversely, when I'm writing history, I try to make it as accessible and engaging as possible. Much of a historian's work is decision making. You get 100 facts. You can only choose one. Almost invariably, the fact that I'm going to choose is the one I think is going to most interest my reader. And the greatest compliment I get as a historian is that my history books read like novels. I love that. So there is a nexus. There are inflection points between the two of them. And but in my mind, they're very, very separate. They come really, I don't know, this lobe, that lobe, different lobes, and or here in the gut. I am working on 2 history projects now. One is actually not so much a history project, it's a political commentary. It's called Israel 2048. It's a vision of what I think Israel should look like on its 100th birthday. It's very policy oriented. It's actually an NGO that I have here. It's doing very well. About a third done with that book. And I am in the process of fundraising. My history books are very expensive. I'm fundraising for what I hope to be the definitive book of Israel's War of Independence.
Mm-hmm. Do you find the Benny Morris book has certain shortcomings?
Well, it depends which one, because Benny Morris went through a road to Damascus conversion. He started off as an extreme left winger until the fall of 2000 and the outbreak of the Second Intifada, when he realized that Intifada came immediately after Israel's offer to the Palestinians of a 2-state solution, including redividing Jerusalem. They turned it down. They turned it down with violence. And Benny concluded, as did many, many people on the left, on the Israeli left, that the struggle was not about as they thought, about the outcome of the 1967 war, but about the outcome of the 1948 war. And so then Benny went back and tried to rewrite some of the things he said. Unfortunately, the things that stick were his earlier writings, The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem, which is, I think, has caused Israel irreversible damage. And I want to be able to rectify some of it and tell a more balanced story.
So there's another comment in the chat, and I'll kind of phrase it as a question. You know, when we talk about people setting historical novels in place, I mean, you've got the example of a Michener who will do centuries worth of research, perhaps so he doesn't have to go too deep at any one moment, but it's, you know, by definition, it's not lived experience. And you started in a place of lived experience, and it'll be interesting in your next novel to see your parents coming from Boston. Your parents have this beautiful story of how they got together around your mom's dad's mechanic shop. Yeah. And it'll be interesting to see if that vignette shows up, because it's a lovely story. And then you've got this intense research and writing to write a definitive work. Many of us consider your work on the 67 war to be the definitive work on the 67 war. So we look forward to that. You say it comes from different places in your brain. Do you have a role model for another author or another author's work that you appreciate who has done both genres, historical nonfiction and fiction?
It is rare. It is rare. I mean, Norman Mailer, I was certainly a fan of Norman Mailer, wrote historical fiction and fiction and nonfiction when he put himself in the middle of it. Like doing that for the Armies of the Night. I have a very fond spot for Ambrose Bierce, who participated in the Battle of Shiloh, writes postmodern, extraordinary. These are stories written in the 19th century. Look like they're written this morning about the Civil War. But he was also a man of action. He was a journalist. He disappeared in the Mexican desert in 1913 looking for Pancho Villa. They never found him. But a wonderful writer and had a great sense of humor. The Devil's Dictionary. I strongly recommend anything by Ambrose Bierce. But you know, today this is also sort of an ideological decision of mine, and I got to confess, and that is that today the overwhelming majority of writers, certainly in the United States, are teaching in English departments or creative writing departments, and they're the product of creative writing departments. So the language becomes very, very similar, and the worldview becomes very, very similar. And I made a conscious decision to lead a different life and to gain different experiences, whether in the military, in diplomacy, in business. And in short stories in particular, I like to think of my stories having 3 layers. One layer is simply the experience. So I can write about being in a war, because I've been in several. I can write about being in Washington, because I've been there. I can write about being in a university. I've been there. The second meaning is simply the story being entertaining. I want the story to be engaging. I want it to have twists. But the third layer is the most important layer. That's the layer in which I want to say something. I want to say something about the human condition. I want to say something about love. I want to say something about relationships, about parents and children, about reality. And that is the same thing true with the novel. It's those three levels of which the experience is probably the least important. And so, I don't have a great role model for somebody like this. Maybe am I self-aggrandizing and I say I'm kind of sui generis or just completely nuts? One of the two. But it's all deeply fulfilling. Irrespective.
Vicky wants private stack to me. Go ahead, Vicky Alvey.
I have a question for you also, going back to the novel and as to whether or not it's saying something. I'm interested about in Sandy Cooper and the choices that he makes, and without going into what those choices are, I'm curious, having informed his life by growing up in America, being an American Jew, I'm wondering, given your experience here and in Israel, could Sandy Cooper have made the same choices as a secular Jew living in Israel? Is there any difference, you think, in what informs him? Would the story have been the same?
No, first of all, you wouldn't be dealing with anti-Semitism, and the military would have played a role in his life.
Right.
And he wouldn't have been playing football. I mean, the transformative experience for Sandy Cooper was getting his leg broken in the Thanksgiving game. And by the way, just parenthetically, that actually happened to a friend of mine named Vito, who was slated to go to Annapolis as Sandy was dreaming, and broke his leg in the Thanksgiving game, and ended up working in his father's dry cleaning business. And some reason I remembered that becomes Sandy's fate, that broken leg. No, I think that if I'm going to say something a little controversial, and that is that maybe the chief characteristic of Sandy Cooper is his passivity, his passiveness. And things happen to him. He doesn't react entirely. And it takes a long time for him to react. And what gets him to react? At the end of the book, again, not a spoiler, I think it's redemptive. I think that Sandy leaves us with hope, even for a passive man like him, that he's going to he has a sense that he could be more. He has a sense that life could be more. And he's unwilling to sacrifice that. That is his assertion. And ultimately, it's redemptive. Again, it's not an easy book. If I have some time to talk about my next book, I have a character, my hero of that book is just the opposite of Sandy Cooper. Very assertive. Not that she, it's a she. It's not that she's not riddled with self-doubt, but she's anything but passive. And I think she's a much more attractive character. Many people have trouble identifying with Sandy because he is so passive. But what can I do? That's the character that came to me. I'm sorry. That's the man who came to me. Just I had to do the best. What can I do? I couldn't say go away, Sandy Cooper.
I have two more questions that are here, and then we do want to hear about your next book and get that preview. The first is, you chose a religious title for a secular story. And you spoke a couple of times in your introduction about this word spirituality, right? Which is often used as the opposite or some alternate path to religion formally. Could you tell us, for you in the writing, what does that word mean to you? And why did you think it was important for this book for you to evoke the religious within it?
Because it's a book about seeking and not finding. And this is where the quote becomes very important. We say this line 4 times a day, correct me, right? As part of the Ashrei prayer. And to my mind, it is one of the most extraordinary and revolutionary concepts that Judaism has offered to the world. Not only is there a God, but that God is approachable if you approach the God with truth, not with sacrifice, okay? Not with fire, not with gold, but with truth. Think about that. Think about what an extraordinary notion that is. And so on the wall of this synagogue, this is emblazoned. Above it, if you remember the old sanctuary, you had the plexiglass bubble. Is it still there, the plexiglass bubble?
Yes,
Which
that's
I
still
guess
there.
was supposed to get us to look up and, you know, see God, but usually it was full of dirt and bird stuff, and right. and the Sandy talks about, you know, how scary it is that these scrolls are hidden in this ark, and, you know, someone should let it out. And all that wisdom in the darkness is kind of spooky, and the eternal flame. And he's surrounded by all of these words and symbols, but he cannot connect spiritually. And you have these figures coming through, like Kalibach, like Eli Wiesel. You have the junior rabbi, who's very much animated and caught up in the Soviet Jewry movement and caught up in Israel. You know, there's posters of Golda Meir and Moshe Dayan in his crowded study, and is full of enthusiasm. But somehow Sandy cannot find spiritual solace in the synagogue. And it's part of his frustration. It's part of his, I would say, you know, his condition on earth is to be frustrated in his search for truth. And he's asking himself, how can I pray? I think it's a very poignant moment when he sits alone in the sanctuary. He says, okay, how do I pray? How do I find truth? How do I even know what truth is? And these are hard questions for the reader, but they are legitimate questions. I think for even a great number of American Jews today, how do we approach prayer? How do you approach God? Where is God? How about all those names on the wall of people who approached God in truth and died anyway? So difficult, again, it's the difficulty of spirituality. It's not a replacement for religion. It's not a replacement for mitzvot. Sandy doesn't keep mitzvot. He doesn't even know what mitzvot are, half, right? He says that. He'll eat bacon on a Sunday morning. He doesn't think about it, but it doesn't relieve him of the need to connect to God. And I think that's what spirituality means. It means connectivity to God.
Nice. And then the last question I have here before we go on to your next topic, unless someone has a burning desire and an unasked question,
Please.
Is that this novel is available in audiobooks. And if you purchase,
Digital.
What's that?
And digital.
And digital. So at least if you purchase the audiobook on Amazon, the version has the narration from Graham Winton, right? I'm wondering if you've listened to your book read by another person and if that changed your experience of it.
Well, I only read one of my books. It was an exhausting experience. I can't tell you how hard it is. It's like days and days of in the studio till your voice dies, and it's kind of a thrill. Usually, as someone who has sort of a British accent, and it's just nice. It's a thrill. It just is. I like it. A greater thrill would be to have one of these stories made into a movie, and you know, I'm represented by a number of agents who are always trying to do that. It hasn't happened yet.
All right, so tell us what you're working on.
So I finished. I was just in the United States, peddling my new novel. It is called Fourth Cliff, and it takes place on an island off the Massachusetts coast. You know, think Nantucket, think Martha's Vineyard. Except this island doesn't exist. I made it up. It's a made-up island, and it's sort of the poor man's version of Nantucket. And the story is set in 1944, 1945, World War II. Most of the men on the island are gone. A lot of the young women have gone off to Boston to work in factories. Left are sort of an old bunch of crotchety fishermen and cranberry farmers, and 90 Italian prisoners of war who have been stuck on this island because they can't go anywhere. And they work. They leave the prisoner camp in the morning. They work. They have relations with the people on the island, and also on the island is a policewoman named Mary Beth Swan, who is a Southie from South Boston, a Catholic woman, Irish Catholic, who married the police captain, Archie of Fourth Cliff. And then Archie got called up to the Marines. This is somewhere in the South Pacific, and has left Mary Beth Swan as the police captain of this island, which is bad enough because everyone there is, anti-feminist and anti-Irish and anti-Catholic. And there are actually no women police captains in the United States at this time. But Mary Beth Swan's problems multiply because one after another, the Italian prisoners of war are getting murdered in rather gruesome ways. So there is a serial killer afoot on Fourth Cliff, and Mary Beth Swan has to catch him or her And what can I say? The FBI gets involved, the mafia gets involved, and I love this character of Mary Beth Swan. If you ask me where this came from, I have no idea. It just came to me one day. Okay, there's Mary Beth Swan. She's a captain, and there are Italian prisoners of war. Historically, it's very accurate. There were Italian prisoner camps for Italians. They kept them separate from the Germans in World War II because the Germans were the real enemies. The Italians were just kind of misguided, and they did work in communities, and everything about it is very, very accurate, down to what Mary Beth wore and what she says and eats. And I just love this book. It is, and she's a very different character than Sandy Cooper. She is not passive. She has many South Dallas Scouts as a member. She's up against immense adversity, but she's also a person of great drive and agency. She has agency.
So it's interesting because where I come from in Western New York, they had German prisoners of war in the 1940s, and they worked on many of the farms. And my grandfather had a canning factory for fruit, and a lot of that part of the American story will be interesting for people to discover because it's really not told. You know, that this was we didn't put them in camps because the idea was, well, where the hell are they going to go?
They can't exactly swim off the island.
Right.
As he says this in the book, they can't swim off the island, and there's been a shortage of labor. All the men are away, so why not use them as fishermen, and why not use them as farmers? And and they did. Problem is they keep on getting knocked off, knocking off the Italians.
So that leads to the what was the film where Jack Nicholson was kind of playing a crazy guy in the diner and he had the love relationship?
Five Easy Pieces.
No, is that the
that
one?
Not hold the mayonnaise, hold the
no, the one where she said
hold the chicken.
Yeah, no, she said he was a writer, and she said, how do you write such wonderful female characters? And he said one of the most insulting, misogynistic lines in the history of film. He said, I write a man and I take away all reason.
Wow. Oh my.
Terrible line, but a laugh line, right? In that film. So, you know, and the only female main character female police officer main character to carry a major film that I'm aware of is Fargo, with a wonderful Midwestern twang and all that stuff. So let me ask that question, the gender question. How do you write a female character?
Beats me.
Probably the best answer. It's better than the Jack Nicholson answer, I'll tell you.
It really beats me. I tell you why, because, you know, in my stories, if you read my short stories, I have one story very much influenced by my experience at Pleasantdale Elementary School, about two retired teachers walking on a beach. It's called Fossils, and they are a lesbian couple who have been together for many decades, and they're having a fight. Ask me not just how I write about women, but how do I write about gay women? And I don't know. They're there as whole characters, and I don't necessarily see them as women. I see them as human beings who, because they're women, they are set with a certain set of they're confronted with a certain set of challenges. And, you know, the gay couple on the beach are set with challenges of being a gay couple back in the 60s, what that was like. But for me, they're just human beings. And that's all I can really say. I'm sort of tongue-tied about it. No one ever asked me that question, how I write women, but it's so funny. I'm already thinking about my next novels, and almost all of them have women protagonists.
It is interesting, and then if there's no final, I guess we'll wrap it up. The question that kind of runs through much of your work, then fiction and nonfiction, seems to be this idea of identity, of belonging, and really in an age in America where we're really bringing forward racial and ethnic differences, racial and ethnic conflicts, historical marginalizations and oppressions, and what the path forward is to what Israel is now talking about after, Lod and Haifa and Akko and so forth. What is a shared society? This concept of what's the role of our differences and how do we get along? Most of your works seem to pivot around conflicts, oppressions, and so forth that have some form of identity conflict associated with it. The racial, the cultural thing, the first female police officer and how she's received in that way, whether Catholics are welcomed or not. Maybe you just take a final concept about why that's an attractive way to have a fulcrum around events, why those are kind of the meaty points of conflict to advance some of what you're writing.
I think the deeper answer to that is that I myself am a person of many identities. And as I think that's what I began talking about, I have a Jewish and Israeli identity, I have an American identity, I have an Israeli identity, I have a writer's identity, a fiction writer and history writer's identity, I have a diplomatic, military, I'm a father, grandfather, all these different identities. And you say, who are you? Well, I'm D, all of the above. I'm all of these. And often my identities bring me into conflict. They do. Just follow me into some time onto American campus where I give a speech, and I'll give you conflict. But I'm also exercising, and I want to go back to talking about this Jewish notion of freedom. I'm asserting my freedom at a time where, certainly in the United States, there is a concerted effort to deny that freedom, to restrict that freedom, to say that if you are a certain color and you are a certain gender, or you belong to a certain class, you can only write about that. And I'm taking, I was warned by my agent that I was going to take flack for this book because I have several African-American characters in this book who are central to the story. And some people may object to a person of, a white, and now I'm a white person, so I'm writing about people of color. Just like in the short stories where I write about people of different sexual orientations. I already got smashed by one reviewer. The only sort of not good review I had, it was a good review. It said nice things about my writing, but really gave me a hard time about one story in The Night Archer where I write about a 14th century Muslim slave who's very violent, but so were all the rulers back then. And she said that it's Islamophobia for doing that, for writing about this guy in the 13th century. So it is I'm perfectly prepared to defend my freedom. That's all I want to say. I've been doing it in this country for 40 some odd years. I want to do it in my books. To paraphrase Patrick Henry, if that be cultural appropriation, make the most of it.
Well, Michael, it is always a pleasure and an honor to have you with us. We're delighted to see you, returning to your roots in many ways, those boyhood dreams that you're fulfilling at this stage in your life. Your life arc, your life story is more than a career. It's really a wonderful passage from place to place and time to time, and you've been part of touching things that have changed the world. And to see that come out creatively in the exploration of the human condition in your fiction writing is a joy. And we look for more and more and more, and we hope that you'll come back in either mode that you wish, anytime you wish, often. And we thank you. So wish you a Shavua Tov and God's blessing on all your work.
Thank you all. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Kol tuv, we say here. Kol tuv. Bye-bye. Bye. Bye.
For those on, we want to thank the Culture and Learning Center for providing this program, to Larry and Vicky for their leadership, to Leslie on all her hard work, and go to clc.b'nai-shalom.net for all of our offerings over time. The Culture and Learning Center is beyond the synagogue and throughout our region. We hope you'll participate with us frequently. We thank you for joining B'nai Shalom, and we wish you well.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. I think the rabbi did a great job. Okay, I'll talk to you and I'll try to get something to you this evening on that intro.